The year was 1878, and the silence of the mountain had become the language Elias Vance understood best. It spoke in the sigh of wind through pine boughs, in the sharp crack of a deadfall branch under a blanket of snow, and in the whisper of his own blood in his ears during the long, star-dusted nights. For 5 years, this silence had been his only constant companion, a presence as real and solid as the granite peaks that clawed at the Colorado sky. His cabin, nestled in a high meadow like a stone dropped in a pool of untouched wilderness, was less a home and more a monument to all he had lost. Every log he had hewn and set in place was a testament to a life that was supposed to have been shared, a future that had burned to ash along with the fever that took his wife, Martha, and their infant son. His days were a litany of survival, a rhythm of necessity that left little room for the ghosts. He chopped wood, the axe falling with a metronomic beat that was the mountain's heartbeat and his own. He checked his trap lines, his movements economical and sure, his eyes scanning for the faintest trace of mink or fox. He hunted, not for sport, but for sustenance, the report of his rifle a jarring punctuation in the otherwise unbroken sentence of quiet. He was a man whittled down to his essential parts, bone, muscle, and a grief so profound it had the physical weight of a second shadow. The loneliness was a cold thing that lived in his marrow, a part of him now, like the scar above his eye from a fall he'd taken years ago. He had come to this isolation seeking an ending, but had found only a long, drawn-out emptiness instead. He had forgotten the sound of another human voice that wasn't a memory. The world of towns, of commerce, of casual greeting and shared burdens felt as distant as a foreign country he had once visited in a dream. He spoke only to his mule, a stubborn creature named Cain, and even then his words were clipped, functional commands that rusted in his throat. Elias had become a part of the mountain, weathered and solitary, his heart girded with the same unyielding stone that formed the ranges around him. He believed this was how his life would unspool to its inevitable end, in silence, in solitude, with only the changing seasons to mark the slow passage of his own decay. He asked for nothing more and expected nothing less. Then, one afternoon in late autumn, as the sky was bruising into the deep purple of an early dusk, the silence was broken. It was not the snap of a twig that alerted him, nor the cry of a hawk. It was a feeling, a subtle shift in the air, a disturbance in the deep quiet he knew so well. He straightened from the woodpile, axe held loose in his hand, his gaze fixed on the tree line at the edge of the meadow. Cain, tethered nearby, lifted his head and let out a low, guttural bray, his ears swiveling forward. Elias's hand tightened on the axe handle. He had not seen another human being in over a year, and strangers in these parts were rarely a cause for celebration. They were prospectors who had lost their way, or worse, men fleeing the law, carrying their troubles with them like a contagion. But what emerged from the dense forest was not what he expected. It was not one man, but a procession of figures, moving with a weariness that seemed to bend their very spines. 7 of them, all women. They were Cheyenne, their buckskin garments torn and stained from hard travel, their faces etched with a bone-deep exhaustion that transcended language. They moved without sound, their feet seeming to barely skim the frost-kissed ground. An older woman, her hair streaked with silver and woven into 2 long braids, walked at the head of the group. Her face was a mask of stoic resolve, but her eyes held the haunted, hollowed-out look of someone who had witnessed the world's end. The 6 who followed were younger, their expressions ranging from fearful to defiant, but all were united by the same aura of desperation. They stopped at the edge of the cleared land, 100 yards from his cabin, a silent, uncertain tableau against the encroaching night. Elias stood frozen, the axe feeling heavy and useless in his hand. This was an intrusion of a magnitude he could not comprehend. His sanctuary, his tomb, had been breached. The women did not move, did not speak. They simply stood there, their presence a profound and unsettling question mark in the stark landscape of his life. The oldest one met his gaze across the clearing, And in that long, silent exchange, Elias Vance felt the first tremor of a change that would shatter his world of solitude forever. The mountain held its breath, and for the first time in 5 years, the silence was filled not with peace, but with a terrible, pressing weight. The older woman took a hesitant step forward, her hand raised, palm open, a universal sign of peace. Elias remained motionless, his mind racing. Soldiers. They had to be running from soldiers. He had heard fractured stories on his rare trips to the distant trading post, tales of tribes being forced onto reservations, of skirmishes and desperate flights. He had paid them no mind. They were the concerns of another world. Now, that world had arrived on his doorstep. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned the axe against the chopping block and stood with his hands empty at his sides. He would not show aggression, but he would not show welcome either. He was a rock, an obstacle, something to be navigated. The woman approached, the others remaining behind, a tight cluster of fear and solidarity. When she was 20 feet away, she stopped. Her English was a fractured thing, pieced together from missionary schools and traders, but her meaning was as clear as the cold mountain air. "We have run far," she said, her voice raspy with disuse and fatigue. "Soldiers took our men, our camp." She gestured vaguely to the east, a sweeping motion that encompassed a world of violence and loss. "We are 7, no food, winter comes." Elias said nothing. He was a master of silence, and he used it now as both shield and weapon. Let her speak, let her reveal the purpose of this impossible visit. The woman's gaze was unwavering. She was not begging. Her pride was a palpable force, a cloak she wore despite her tattered clothing. "They say a white man lives here, alone, far from the forts, far from towns." Her eyes searched his face, seeking something he was not sure he possessed. "We do not ask for help. We do not ask for shelter." She paused, gathering the words, the concept she was about to present so alien that it took a moment to form. "We ask you to decide." Elias blinked. "Decide what?" The words felt like gravel in his mouth. "Our fate," she said, the words falling with devastating simplicity. "You can tell the soldiers, they will find us, take us back, or you can let us go." She gestured toward the impassable peaks behind his cabin, where the first snows already lay thick. "We will walk into the high country, to the spirits." It was a death sentence, and they both knew it. There was no third option, no path to safety. They were asking him to be their judge, their executioner, or their passive accomplice to a slow, freezing end. He stared at her, then at the 6 younger women huddled together, their dark eyes fixed on him like a jury. He had fled from the world to escape the burdens of connection, the terrible weight of responsibility for another's life. And now 7 strangers had appeared out of the wilderness to lay the heaviest burden of all at his feet. The absurdity of it was a bitter taste in his mouth. He, Elias Vance, a ghost of a man, was being asked to play God. He turned without a word and walked to his cabin. He did not look back. He opened the heavy plank door, stepped inside, and shut it firmly behind him, plunging the room into the familiar gloom of his solitary existence. But this time the silence was different. It was listening, it was waiting. Outside, 7 women stood in the falling darkness, their destiny now a prisoner within the walls of his broken heart. Inside the cabin, Elias stoked the embers in the hearth, the small hiss and pop of the fire, the only sound. He moved with the forced deliberation of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. He could not process the request. It was a madness born of desperation. Decide their fate. The words echoed in the small, cramped space. He could do nothing. That was the simplest path. Ignore them. They would eventually leave, disappearing into the mountains to meet the end they had spoken of. His life would return to its silent rhythm. The thought brought him no comfort. Instead, a cold knot of something that felt horribly like shame tightened in his gut. He looked around the cabin, at the single cot, the rough-hewn table with 1 chair, the pegs on the wall where Martha's worn dress had once hung. This was a place of ghosts, a shrine to an ending. What right did he have to preside over the ending of others? He walked to the small, grimy window and peered out. They hadn't moved. They stood like statues carved from the twilight, their resilience a quiet accusation. A gust of wind swept down from the peaks, carrying the first stinging flakes of snow. It was a harbinger. The mountain was making its own decision. A deep, shuddering sigh escaped his lips, a sound of profound weariness. He could not send them to their deaths, not by action or inaction, but he could not shelter them. He was not equipped for it. His supplies were measured for one man through a long winter. His space was meant for one. His heart was built for one. Yet, the image of their faces, particularly the haunted eyes of the old woman, was seared into his mind. He saw in her a mirror of his own loss, a grief as vast and unforgiving as the landscape they now shared. With a curse that was half a prayer, he pulled on his heavy coat, grabbed a lantern, and stepped back out into the biting wind. The snow was coming down harder now, small, sharp flecks that clung to his beard. He walked not towards the women, but towards the sturdy barn he had built for Cain and the milk cow he no longer owned. He swung open the heavy doors, the scent of dry hay and animal musk rolling out to meet him. He lit the lantern, its golden glow pushing back the shadows, revealing stacks of hay, empty stalls, and the quiet, munching form of his mule. It was shelter. Not much, but it was more than the open wilderness offered. He turned and walked back toward the women, holding the lantern high. They watched his approach, their faces impassive in the flickering light. He stopped before the old woman. "The barn," he said, his voice rough. "There is hay. It is dry. Stay there for the night." He did not offer food, he did not offer comfort. He offered 4 walls and a roof. It was a temporary stay, a postponement of the decision they had forced upon him. The woman, whose name he would later learn was Vivina, simply nodded. She spoke to the others in the soft, flowing sounds of the Cheyenne language. Without a word to him, they followed her toward the barn, a silent, ghostly procession moving through the swirling snow. The youngest of them, a girl with fire in her eyes, shot him a look of pure, undiluted mistrust before disappearing into the darkness of the barn. Elias watched until the last one was inside. Then he pulled the heavy doors almost closed, leaving a gap for air. He did not bar it. That felt like an act of a jailer, and whatever he was to these women, he would not be that. He returned to his cabin and bolted the door. The immediate crisis was averted, but the larger one loomed. 7 people were in his barn. 7 lives were in his hands. He sank into his chair by the fire, the silence of his home now feeling fragile, a thin veneer over a deep and turbulent sea. The mountain was no longer his alone. The first days were a tense and silent truce. Elias went about his chores with a rigid formality, acutely aware of the eyes that watched him from the shadows of the barn. He split wood, hauled water, and checked his traps, all under the silent scrutiny of his unexpected guests. He left a bucket of water and a portion of smoked venison by the barn door each morning. It was a transaction, nothing more. He was providing basic sustenance in exchange for, he wasn't sure what. Time, perhaps. Time to think. The women rarely emerged during the day. He would catch glimpses of them, moving like wraiths in the grey light, gathering firewood from the edge of the forest or tending to some private, unseen task. They were a self-contained unit, a world unto themselves. Their resilience was astounding. They had arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs, yet they carried on with a quiet dignity that was both unnerving and deeply admirable. He learned to differentiate them, not by name, but by presence. There was Vivina, the clear leader, her authority unquestioned. She was the only one who would meet his gaze directly. Then there was the young, hostile one, Mesa. She watched him with an unconcealed suspicion, her posture always defensive, as if expecting a blow. Another, Neva, was quiet and observant, her hands always busy, mending a torn piece of buckskin or weaving something from pine needles. The other 4 were a blur of anxious faces, their fear a constant, low hum in the air. The snow did not stop. It fell for 3 days straight, a thick, smothering blanket that transformed the world into a stark canvas of white and grey. The mountain passes became impassable. The world beyond his meadow ceased to exist. They were trapped, all of them, in this isolated pocket of the world. The decision he had been postponing was now made for him by the weather. They were here for the winter. The thought landed in his stomach like a stone. The reality of their shared confinement forced a change. The silent offerings of food at the barn door were no longer sufficient. One evening, as a blizzard howled outside, a new and more ferocious beast than any he had ever hunted, he found himself cooking a large stew of rabbit and root vegetables. The aroma filled the small cabin, a scent of warmth and life that felt alien. On impulse, he ladled a huge portion into his largest pot, pulled on his coat, and battled his way through the wind and drifting snow to the barn. He pushed open the door and was met with a scene of quiet domesticity that startled him. A small, smoky fire burned in a makeshift stone pit in the center of the earthen floor. The women were huddled around it, wrapped in thin blankets he hadn't known they possessed. They looked up as he entered, their faces illuminated by the firelight, their expressions wary. Mesa immediately rose to her feet, her hand instinctively going to a large stick she kept by her side. Elias ignored her. He walked to the fire and set the heavy pot down near the flames. "It is cold," he said, the words feeling inadequate. He turned to leave, his duty done. "Wait." It was Vivina's voice. He paused at the door, his back to them. "You have a name." It was a statement, not a question. He hesitated, the simple act of sharing his name feeling like a concession, a crack in the wall he had so carefully built around himself. "Elias," he said, his voice low. "I am Vivina," she replied. She then gestured to the others, naming each one in turn. He didn't catch them all, but he heard Mesa's name spoken with a quiet firmness, and Neva's with a softer tone. When she was finished, a new kind of silence fell between them, one that was less about suspicion and more about acknowledgement. He had a name, they had names. They were no longer just a man and a group of refugees. They were people sharing a space, sharing a storm. He gave a curt nod and left, the wind whipping the door shut behind him. As the weeks turned into a month, a fragile routine began to form. The blizzard broke, but the snow lay deep, locking them in. Necessity forced them into a reluctant collaboration. Elias's traps yielded little in the deep winter, and his stores of smoked meat were dwindling faster than he had planned. One morning, Vivina appeared at his cabin door as he was cleaning his rifle. "We hunt," she said simply. Elias looked at her, then at the rifle in his hands. "You know how to use this?" She shook her head. "Our men hunted, but we know the ways of the forest, the signs, the tracks, better than you." There was no arrogance in her voice, only fact. "You have the weapon, we have the skill. Together we eat." He was skeptical, but his dwindling supplies spoke louder than his pride. He agreed. He took Vivina and the wary Mesa out with him. He was a proficient hunter, but he quickly saw that Vivina was right. They moved through the snow-laden forest with a grace and silence he could never match. They saw things he missed, a barely perceptible track in the snow, a branch nibbled by a deer, the distant call of a bird that signaled game nearby. He taught Vivina the basics of the rifle, how to load it, how to aim, how to account for the wind, how to squeeze the trigger without jerking. She was a quick study, her hands steady, her eyes sharp. It was Mesa, however, who spotted the elk, a lone bull separated from its herd, foraging for lichen on a high ridge. It was a long shot, too long for a novice. Elias prepared to take it himself, but Vivina put a hand on his arm. "Let me," she said. He saw the grim determination in her eyes and acquiesced. She lay prone in the snow, just as he had shown her, taking slow, deep breaths. The rifle cracked, its sound swallowed by the vast, white wilderness. The elk staggered, then fell. The work of dressing the animal was immense, but together, the three of them managed it. They hauled the meat back to the cabin in a laborious day-long effort, their shared exhaustion a bond stronger than any words. That night, for the first time, the women did not eat in the barn. Elias cleared the clutter from his cabin, and they all shared the meal inside, crowded around the hearth. The silence was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer the silence of suspicion, but of shared effort and quiet respect. A turning point came when Elias gashed his hand badly while chopping wood. The cut was deep, right across his palm, and it bled profusely. He wrapped it in a rag, but he knew it was bad. The cold made infection a serious risk. He sat by the fire, grimly contemplating the possibility of losing the use of his hand, when Neva appeared silently at his side. Before he could protest, she gently took his hand, unwrapping the bloody rag. She examined the wound with a clinical detachment, then left without a word. She returned moments later with a small pouch and a cup of steaming water. She mixed a poultice of dried herbs and what looked like crushed bark, creating a thick, dark paste. She cleaned the wound with startling efficiency and applied the poultice. It stung, but almost immediately, a strange warmth spread through his hand, dulling the throbbing pain. She then wrapped it tightly with clean strips of cloth she had produced from somewhere. "Keep it dry," she whispered, the first words he had ever heard her speak directly to him. She met his eyes for only a second, a flicker of profound sadness in their depths, and then she was gone, melting back into the quiet corners of the cabin. Over the next few days, Neva changed the dressing daily. The wound, which should have festered, healed cleanly and quickly, leaving behind a neat, pale scar. Elias watched her, this quiet, unassuming woman, and felt a sense of awe. She possessed a knowledge, a power that he could not comprehend. He had offered them the brute necessities of shelter and a weapon. They, in turn, were offering him something far more profound: healing, wisdom, a connection to a world he had never known. He began to see them not as a collective burden, but as individuals, each with her own story etched into the lines of her face. He learned through Vivina that Mesa's husband and son had been killed in the soldiers' raid, the source of the untamed fire in her eyes. He saw the way the other women deferred to Vivina, not out of fear, but out of a deep and abiding respect. He noticed how they cared for the youngest among them, a girl barely a woman, sheltering her from the harshest realities of their situation. One evening, sitting by the fire, he found himself speaking of Martha. The words came out haltingly at first, rusty from disuse. He told Vivina about her, about the cabin they were meant to build together, about the son he had held for only 6 short months. He did not look at her as he spoke, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. When he was done, a heavy silence filled the room. He expected platitudes, or worse, pity. Instead, Vivina simply said, "Your ghost is strong, she watches over this place." She then began to softly chant, a low, melodic sound that was not sad but soothing. It was a song of remembrance, of acknowledging the spirits that walked beside them. In that moment, Elias felt a piece of the ice that had encased his heart for 5 years begin to melt. He was not just a man with a past, he was a man whose grief was being witnessed, acknowledged, and honored. He was not alone in his sorrow. The deep cold of January gave way to the biting winds of February. Life in the cabin settled into a new kind of normal. It was a crowded, communal existence, a far cry from the solitude he had once craved. The women's quiet resilience had transformed the space. They tanned the elk hide, creating warm cloaks and mending their worn clothing. They taught him which winter berries were safe to eat and how to make a nourishing broth from pine needles. In return, he shared his tools, teaching them how to use his knives to carve and his awl to stitch leather. The cabin was no longer a tomb, it was a workshop, a refuge, a home. The change in Mesa was the most gradual and the most profound. Her open hostility softened into a guarded watchfulness, which in turn gave way to a grudging respect. She saw that Elias treated them not as captives or inferiors, but as equals in their shared fight for survival. He never demanded, never threatened. He shared what he had freely and worked alongside them without complaint. One afternoon, she found him struggling to repair a broken snowshoe frame. Without a word, she took it from him, and with deft, sure movements, used sinew she had prepared to bind the frame together, making it stronger than it had been before. She handed it back to him, their eyes meeting for a brief, significant moment. It was an apology and an acceptance, all without a single word being spoken. The fragile peace of their isolated world was shattered on a clear, cold morning in early March. Elias was returning from checking a line of snares when he saw them, two men on snowshoes, making their way across the meadow towards his cabin. They were not soldiers. They were trappers, by the look of their rough fur clothing and the long rifles they carried. A cold dread, an emotion he hadn't felt in years, washed over him. He was no longer just protecting himself. He hurried back to the cabin, his heart pounding. "Inside," he said, his voice low and urgent. "All of you, and be silent." The women needed no further explanation. They disappeared into the cabin, their movements swift and silent as shadows. Vivina paused at the door, her eyes locking with his. He gave her a sharp nod, and she closed the door, leaving him to face the newcomers alone. He stood by the woodpile, affecting a casual air he did not feel, his axe resting nearby. The two men approached, their strides confident, arrogant. The leader was a big, bearded man with small, mean eyes. His companion was younger, leaner, with a cruel twist to his mouth. "Howdy," the big man said, his voice a gravelly boom that seemed to defile the clean mountain air. "Didn't expect to find nobody this high up." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Name's Garrett. This here's Owen." Elias nodded, saying nothing. His silence was a wall. "We been tracking a rumor," Garrett continued, his eyes scanning the cabin, the barn, the telltale signs of habitation. "Heard a bunch of Cheyenne squaws broke from the reservation down south, headed this way. You seen anything like that?" "I see no one," Elias said, his voice flat. "I live alone." Owen chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "Alone? Funny. That's a mighty big pile of firewood for one man, and that hide stretching over there, that's fresh. Too big for one man to haul and dress on his own before it froze solid." He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "We know they're here. There's a bounty on 'em, a tidy sum. We'd be willing to share a piece of it for your cooperation." The word bounty sent a chill down Elias's spine. These men weren't just opportunistic, they were predators. They saw the women not as people, but as livestock, a source of profit. A rage, cold and pure, began to smolder within him. He thought of Vivina's dignity, Neva's quiet healing, Mesa's fierce, broken heart. "There is no one here," Elias repeated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "You've wasted your time. The pass is treacherous. You should head back down before the weather turns." It was a dismissal and a threat. Garrett's smile vanished. He was not a man accustomed to being told what to do. He looked from Elias's cold eyes to the axe handle near his hand, then back again. He was weighing the odds. A fight with a determined mountain man in his own territory was a risky proposition. For now. "All right, friend," Garrett said, his voice dripping with false congeniality. "We'll be on our way, but we got long memories, and we'll be back." He gestured to Owen, and the two men turned, their snowshoes crunching with aggressive purpose as they retreated across the meadow. Elias watched until they were swallowed by the trees. He did not relax. He did not breathe easy. He knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in his veins, that this was not over. They had seen something, or sensed something, and their greed was a powerful motivator. They would be back, and they would likely not come back alone. The external world, with all its cruelty and prejudice, had found them. Their sanctuary was about to become a battleground. He picked up his axe and walked back to the cabin, the weight of 7 lives, and now his own, resting squarely on his shoulders. The days that followed were thick with a tension that was almost unbearable. The easy, quiet rhythm they had established was gone, replaced by a state of constant vigilance. Elias felt like a man living on a fault line, waiting for the earth to tear itself apart. He reinforced the cabin door with a heavy bar and boarded up the single small window in the back. He cleaned and oiled his rifle and the old pistol he kept stored away, his movements precise and deadly serious. There would be no more warnings. The next time Garrett and Owen came, it would be with violence. Inside the cabin, the women worked with a silent, focused intensity. He saw Vivina speaking to them in low, urgent tones. He saw Mesa practicing with a bow and arrows she had painstakingly crafted from hickory and sinew, her aim becoming more accurate with each passing day. Neva prepared medicines and bandages, her face a grim mask of determination. They were not waiting to be rescued. They were preparing for war. They had been victims once. They would not be again. Elias found himself in a role he had never imagined, a commander, a protector. He and Vivina planned their defense like two generals. He knew the rifle, she knew strategy. They decided on lines of fire, fallback positions. He gave the old pistol to Mesa, showing her how to load and fire the heavy weapon. Her hands did not tremble. Her eyes were chips of obsidian. "They will come at dawn," Vivina said one evening, her eyes on the setting sun. "It is the way of cowards who think themselves predators." Elias nodded. He had thought the same thing. The waiting was the worst part. The nights were sleepless, filled with the sounds of the wind and the creaking of the cabin walls, every noise a potential threat. During this time, he and the women spoke little, but their shared purpose forged a bond deeper than any words. He was no longer Elias Vance, the grieving hermit. He was their shield. And they, in turn, were his reason to stand and fight. He was not just defending them, he was defending the flicker of life they had reignited within his own soul. 3 days after the trappers' first visit, Vivina's prediction came true. The attack came in the grey, pre-dawn light, a time when the cold was at its most bitter and spirits were at their lowest. There were 4 of them this time, dark figures emerging from the tree line, moving in a crouched, determined line toward the cabin. Garrett and Owen had brought friends. "They are here," Elias said calmly from his post by the front window. The women were already in their positions, Mesa by the side window with the pistol, Vivina near the door with the rifle, the others with makeshift weapons, boiling water, heavy clubs, sharpened sticks. "Let them get closer," Vivina counseled, her voice steady. The 4 men spread out, clearly intending to storm the cabin from multiple sides. They thought they were attacking a lone man, expecting an easy fight and a quick victory. They were about to learn how wrong they were. When they were 50 yards away, Garrett raised his hand and let out a triumphant yell. It was his last. Vivina's rifle shot was clean and true. The sound echoed across the silent meadow, a shocking clap of thunder. Garrett staggered, clutching his shoulder, his yell turning into a roar of pain and rage. The other 3 men immediately dropped to the snow, returning fire. Bullets slammed into the log walls of the cabin, splintering the wood. The fight was a chaotic blur of noise and violence. Elias fired his own rifle from the main window, reloading with frantic speed, the smell of gunpowder filling the small space. He was not a natural killer, but the cold fury that drove him made his hands steady. He was protecting his home. He was protecting his family. Mesa fired the heavy pistol from her position, the weapon bucking in her hands. Her shot went wide, but it forced one of the attackers to scramble for new cover, exposing him for a brief second. Elias took the shot, and the man fell, unmoving, in the snow. Owen let out a scream of rage and charged the cabin, firing his pistol wildly. Suddenly, an arrow whistled from a small gap in the cabin wall and buried itself in Owen's leg. He howled and collapsed, clawing at the shaft. It was Mesa's shot, her bow proving more effective in the close quarters than the unwieldy pistol. The fight devolved into a desperate siege. The 2 remaining attackers, including the wounded Garrett, took cover behind the woodpile, pinning them down with steady fire. The air in the cabin was thick with smoke and the metallic scent of fear. One of the younger women was crying softly in the corner, but never was at her side, a calming presence in the storm of violence. Then, disaster struck. A lucky shot from Garrett's rifle shattered the wood near Elias's window, sending a spray of sharp splinters into his side. He cried out, a sharp intake of breath, as a searing pain shot through his ribs. He stumbled back, his rifle clattering to the floor. Elias! Vivina's voice was sharp with alarm. He pressed a hand to his side, feeling the warm, wet stickiness of his own blood. The pain was dizzying. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't hold him. The world began to swim in a grey haze. Through the ringing in his ears, he could hear the triumphant shouts of the men outside. They knew he was hit. They were preparing for their final rush. It was over. He had failed. But as Garrett and the last man rose from behind the woodpile to charge, the cabin door flew open. It was not surrender. Vivina stood silhouetted in the doorway, the rifle at her shoulder. She fired, and the last of the trappers fell backward. Garrett, now alone and clutching his wounded shoulder, froze in disbelief. Before he could raise his weapon, Mesa was on him. She moved like a striking panther, a long knife in her hand. She did not scream, she did not hesitate. Her movements were a blur of righteous fury. Garrett, the loud, arrogant man, made a sound that was little more than a terrified squeak before he, too, was silenced. The sudden, ringing quiet that followed was more shocking than the noise of the battle. It was over. In the meadow, 4 dark shapes lay still in the blood-stained snow. Vivina and Mesa stood over them for a moment, their breath pluming in the frigid air before turning and rushing back inside to where Elias lay bleeding on the floor. The battle for the cabin was won. The world swam back into focus for Elias in fragments of pain and sensation. He felt gentle hands cleaning the wound in his side, the sharp, clean scent of Neva's herbs, and the pressure of a tightly wound bandage. He tried to sit up, but was pushed back down by a firm, insistent hand. He opened his eyes to see Mesa's face above him, her expression a complex mixture of concern and a fierce, proprietary resolve. The open hostility he had once seen in her eyes was gone completely, replaced by something that looked unnervingly like gratitude. "Be still," she commanded softly. "The bleeding has stopped." He lay back, his body aching, his head throbbing. The cabin was quiet now, save for the crackling of the fire and the low, murmuring voices of the women. The aftermath of the violence was all around them. The splintered wood, the lingering smell of gunpowder, the heavy, unspoken knowledge of what had transpired in the meadow. They had survived, together. The days that followed were a blur of healing, both for his body and for the shattered peace of their sanctuary. Neva tended to his wound with a devotion that humbled him. The splinter had gone deep, and the risk of infection was high, but her knowledge of mountain remedies was profound. She kept the wound clean and applied poultices that drew out the inflammation, her quiet competence a constant, reassuring presence. The other women took over his chores, chopping wood and hauling water, their movements efficient and sure. They nursed him back to health with a tenderness he had not known since Martha was alive. In the quiet of his recovery, the unspoken question of their arrival returned. The question of their fate. He realized, with a clarity that was both startling and absolute, that he had already made his decision. He had made it the moment he stood between them and the trappers. He had sealed it with his own blood. Their fate was his fate. This small cabin, once his refuge from the world, had become their shared fortress. As the March sun grew stronger, melting the deep snow and turning the meadow into a muddy field, the mountain began to stir from its long slumber. The passes would soon be clear. The world would soon be accessible again. One evening, as they shared a meal of roasted grouse, Vivina looked at him, her dark eyes clear and direct. "The snows are leaving," she said. "It will be time for us to go." Elias felt a pang of something he could only describe as loss. He had grown accustomed to the life in the cabin, the quiet companionship, the shared purpose. The thought of returning to the crushing silence of his former life was unbearable. "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "We will travel north," Vivina explained. "There are other bands of our people scattered by the soldiers. We will find them. We must." It was not a choice, it was a duty, a sacred obligation to reunite what had been broken. He nodded, understanding. He had no right to ask them to stay. This place had been a temporary haven, a port in a storm, but it was not their home. Their home was with their people. The day of their departure arrived on a bright, cool morning in late April. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. The women had gathered their few belongings. They had mended their clothes, fashioned new moccasins from the elk hide, and prepared bundles of dried meat for their journey. They stood before him outside the cabin, the 7 of them, their faces solemn. The awkwardness of their first meeting was gone, replaced by the deep, unspoken bond of shared survival. Vivina stepped forward and placed a hand on his chest, over his heart. "You are a good man, Elias Vance," she said. "You did not decide our fate. You shared it. The spirits will honor you for this." Elias found he could not speak, a lump thick in his throat. He merely nodded. One by one, the other women came forward, each touching his arm or giving a small, respectful nod. When it was Mesa's turn, she paused before him. She pressed a small, smooth object into his hand. He looked down and saw it was a bird, exquisitely carved from a piece of pine, its wings outstretched as if in flight. "For your ghost," she whispered, her eyes meeting his, "so she does not fly alone." And with that, they turned and walked away, not looking back. He watched them cross the meadow and disappear into the trees, a silent, resilient line of women moving toward their future. He stood there for a long time, the small wooden bird clutched in his hand, its smooth contours a comfort against his palm. He was alone again. He walked back into the cabin, and the silence that greeted him was profound. But it was not the same empty, suffocating silence he had known before. This silence was different. It was filled with echoes of Vivina's quiet wisdom, of Neva's healing touch, of Mesa's fiery spirit, of the shared laughter and quiet determination that had filled this small space for one long, transformative winter. He walked to the small mantelpiece over the hearth and gently placed the carved bird next to the faded photograph of Martha he kept there. The two objects, one a memory of a life lost, and the other, a symbol of a life reclaimed, sat together in perfect harmony. The mountain was quiet once more, but Elias Vance was no longer just a resident of its solitude. He was its keeper, a guardian of the sanctuary that had healed not only 7 desperate women, but a man who had forgotten how to live. His grief remained, a part of him always, but it no longer had the weight of a tombstone. It was simply a scar, a mark of a life that had been lived and loved and was now, finally, ready to begin again. The sun was a hammer in the year of 1884, and the desert of the Arizona Territory was its anvil. Upon that anvil lay Esther Hale, a creature of stark, unfortunate contrast. She was a woman built of soft edges and pale surfaces, too large and too white for a world that demanded hardness and shade. Her skin, which held no color of its own, had been blistered by the relentless light, peeling away in translucent sheets to reveal an angry, weeping pink beneath. Her hair, a shock of snow white that had been the subject of cruel fascination her entire life, was now matted with dust and sweat, clinging to her skull like a fright wig. She was a great, foundering ship of a woman, beached on an ocean of sand and stone, her belly a high, taut drum, carrying the last of her hope. He had left her here 2 days ago, Walter, the man who had paid for her, paraded her, and then discarded her. He had called her his pale lily, his moonflower, his voice dripping with a showman's charm that curdled into contempt the moment the curtain fell. He had brought her out under the guise of seeing the painted canyons, his words a thin veneer over an intention as sharp and cruel as a shard of obsidian. When the wagon had broken an axle in a place where the world was nothing but baked earth and skeletal cacti, he had looked at her, his eyes finally devoid of any pretense. "An encumbrance," he had said, the words as flat and hot as the air. He had taken the water, the mule, and what little remained of their supplies, and he had walked away, swallowed by the shimmering heat. At first, a dull disbelief had cushioned her. He would come back. It was a test, another of his strange, cruel games. But as the first day bled into a bruised purple twilight, and then a night of profound, star-pricked silence, the truth began to solidify in her gut, a cold, heavy stone. The second day had been a lesson in agony. Thirst was a living thing, a predator with claws that scraped her throat raw. The child within her, once a comfort of flutters and rolls, had grown still, a heavy, worrying weight. Esther had tried to move, to drag her considerable body toward the shade of a rock outcropping, but the effort left her breathless, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Now, on the third day, resignation had begun to settle over her like a shroud. She no longer felt the burn of her skin or the sharp craving for water. A strange, listless peace descended. She thought of her life, a parade of gawking faces and hushed whispers. Born an albino, she was an oddity. Growing into a woman of size, she became a spectacle. Walter had seen a business opportunity, marrying the giant pale woman and charging folks a nickel to see her sitting in a velvet-lined booth at county fairs. She had hated it, yet she had endured it, because loneliness was a far greater torment than shame. She had even believed in some foolish, hollow part of her heart that his ownership of her might one day soften into something resembling care. The baby had been a shock, a complication he had not intended. An encumbrance. She closed her eyes, the light still searing through her thin, pink-veined lids. The world had dissolved into a hum, the buzz of insects, the whisper of the hot wind. This, then, was the end of the spectacle. No crowds, no nickels, no velvet booth, just the sun, the sand, and the silent, immense judgment of the sky. She laid a hand on her belly, a final, futile gesture of protection. It was not her own death she mourned in that moment, but the death of the small, innocent life that had never had a chance to draw a single breath in a world that had been so unkind to its mother. The hum grew louder, resolving itself into a rhythm, a soft, steady thudding that was not the frantic beat of her own heart. Hoofbeats. She thought it was a trick of the heat, a final mirage conjured by a dying mind. But the sound grew closer, more distinct. She forced her cracked lips apart, but no sound came out. She managed, with a final surge of will, to pry her eyelids open. A figure swam in the wavering curtain of heat, a horse and a rider, dark against the blinding glare. As it drew nearer, the shape solidified. A man, his skin the color of burnished copper, his long black hair bound by a simple leather cord. He was lean, dressed in buckskin, and he carried himself with a stillness that seemed a part of the landscape itself. He was Cheyenne, or Apache, or one of the other tribes Walter had spoken of, with a mixture of fear and revulsion. He stopped his horse a dozen yards away, his gaze sweeping over the broken wagon, then settling on her. Honyahaka had been tracking a ghost. The memory of his wife, taken by the coughing sickness 2 winters past, often drove him out into the solitary places where the silence was loud enough to hear her whisper on the wind. He was not hunting or raiding, he was simply being, letting the land hold his grief as it had held the lives of his people for generations. He had seen the unnatural shape of the broken wagon from a ridge, a scar of civilization on the unblemished face of the desert. Curiosity and a deep-seated caution had drawn him closer. Then he had seen her. At first, he did not understand what he was looking at. She was a mound of white and red, like a fallen cloud stained by the sunset. Her skin was a horror, cooked by the sun he had learned to respect as both a giver and taker of life. As he dismounted and approached, his movements fluid and silent, the details came into focus. The impossibly pale hair, the large, swollen body, the pronounced swell of her belly. He had seen albinos among his own people, rare and often considered spiritually significant, but he had never seen one so afflicted. Her eyes fluttered open, the palest blue, almost colorless, filled with a terror so profound it transcended any barrier of language or race. He felt no revulsion. He saw no spectacle. He saw a human being at the very edge of the cliff of life, about to be pushed over by the indifferent hand of the sun. He saw a mother, her child's life tied to her own fading thread. Duty was a concept woven deep into the fabric of his soul. To leave her would be to commit a violence against the natural order, an act of profound disrespect to the spirits that governed the world. He unslung the waterskin from his horse, his movements deliberate and calm, trying to telegraph his intent. He knelt beside her, the heat of the ground seeping through his moccasins. He uncorked the skin, and the simple sound of sloshing water made her entire body tremble. He lifted her head gently, his hand surprisingly cool against her fiery neck, and brought the water to her lips. Esther drank. The water was a shock, a miracle. It hurt her throat, but it was the pain of life returning, not departing. She choked and sputtered, and he waited patiently, letting her take small, careful sips. He said nothing. His face was a mask of concentration, his dark eyes focused on the task. She looked at him, at the high cheekbones, the strong line of his jaw, the deep-set eyes that held a sorrow she recognized because she wore her own version of it. He was not the savage of Walter's stories. He was just a man who had not walked away. When she could drink no more, he let her head rest back on the sand and stood. He scanned the horizon, his gaze analytical. They could not stay here. He looked at her, then at his horse. She was a large woman, and in her condition moving her would be a great challenge, but it was a challenge he would meet. His decision was made in silence, communicated not with words, but with the quiet, resolute set of his shoulders. He would not let the desert claim this woman and her child, not today. The journey to a place of shelter was a blur of misery for Esther. Honyahaka worked with an unnerving efficiency. He used blankets from the ruined wagon to rig a travois, a simple sledge dragged behind his horse. Getting her onto it was an ordeal that cost them both dearly in sweat and strained muscles, a slow, awkward dance of necessity. He was strong, his movements economical, but her weight was considerable. He never grunted in frustration or showed any sign of impatience, though she saw the tautness in his arms and the sweat beading on his brow. For her, every jostle of the travois was a fresh agony, a fire licking at her raw skin, a deep, unsettling pressure in her womb. She drifted in and out of consciousness, the world a painful smear of blue sky and brown rock. He took her to a place the rock had hollowed out, a shallow cave tucked into the base of a mesa, its mouth shaded by a gnarled, ancient juniper. It was cooler here, the air still and smelling of dust and dry stone. He eased her off the travois onto a bed of blankets, his touch firm but careful. For the next several days, their world shrank to the confines of that cave. Their interactions were almost entirely without words. He would leave at dawn, melting into the landscape, and return hours later with a rabbit or a brace of quail. He would leave water for her, and she would sip it sparingly, hoarding it like treasure. The first time he tended to her burns, she flinched away, a raw cry tearing from her throat. Her body was a landscape of pain, and she could not bear the thought of a stranger's touch upon it. He stopped instantly, holding up his hands, palms open. In one hand, he held a poultice of crushed leaves, green and pungent. He made a gesture, pointing to his own sun-darkened arm, then to the paste, then to her blistered skin. He was asking permission. The gesture was so unexpected, so respectful, that it disarmed her. Walter had never asked permission for anything. Trembling, she gave a weak, hesitant nod. His touch was clinical, impersonal, yet profoundly gentle. He applied the cool, soothing mash to her shoulders and face, his fingers moving with a practiced skill that spoke of a deep knowledge of the earth's remedies. The relief was immediate, a blessed quenching of the fire that had consumed her. She watched him, her fear slowly being replaced by a wary curiosity. He was a puzzle. He moved with a quiet grace, his existence a series of deliberate, purposeful actions. He never wasted emotion, never made a sound that was not necessary. He was the most silent man she had ever known, and yet his presence filled the small cave completely. Sometimes, in the depths of the night, she would wake and see him sitting by the small, smokeless fire he built at the cave's mouth, staring into the flames. In those moments, his face was not a mask. It was a study in loss, his features softened by a grief so profound it seemed to emanate from him like heat. He was a man hollowed out by something, and she understood that emptiness. It was a terrain they shared, a desolate landscape of the heart. Her prejudice, the fear and suspicion planted by Walter and the world she came from, began to wither in the face of his quiet, consistent decency. He was not saving a white woman, he was tending to a fellow creature in pain. The simplicity of it was staggering. One afternoon, he returned not with game, but with a small, intricately woven basket. He sat before her and began to work with thin strips of yucca fiber, his long fingers moving with a mesmerizing dexterity. He was mending the basket, his attention wholly absorbed. Without thinking, Esther spoke, her voice a rusty croak. "What is your name?" He looked up, startled, as if he had forgotten she possessed a voice. He studied her for a long moment, then spoke a single word, his voice low and raspy from disuse. "Honya Haka." "Honya Haka," she repeated, the syllables foreign and beautiful on her tongue. "I am Esther." He gave a slow nod, a flicker of something in his dark eyes. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was a beginning, an acknowledgement. They were no longer just a task and a patient. They were two people with names. The days turned into a week, then two. A routine, as spare and essential as the landscape around them, took hold. Esther's strength began to return. The angry red of her skin faded to a blotchy pink, then began to heal under Honya Haka's care. She could sit up, then stand, leaning against the cool rock wall of the cave. She began to help in small ways, sorting the herbs he brought back, using a needle and thread from her abandoned reticule to mend a tear in his buckskin shirt. The act of sewing, so mundane and familiar, was a comfort, a small piece of her old life, made useful in this new, strange one. Their conversations were halting, built from the handful of English words he knew and the simple gestures they had perfected. He taught her the name of the rabbit, Vohu, and the juniper tree, Ho-Ho-Na. She, in turn, pointed to the sky and said, "Sky," and the moon and said, "Moon." Each new word was a fragile thread woven between them, slowly creating a tapestry of shared understanding. One evening, as he cooked their meal over the fire, the baby inside her gave a sudden, powerful kick. Esther gasped, her hand flying to her belly. Honya Haka looked over, his eyes questioning. She smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached her pale eyes. "The baby," she said, her voice soft. "It moves." He came to her side, his usual reserve momentarily gone. He looked at her swollen abdomen with an expression of awe, the same look he had when he watched an eagle soar or a thunderstorm gather over the plains. He hesitated, then slowly raised his hand, his gaze asking permission as it had before. Esther took his hand and placed it on her belly. His fingers were calloused and warm. Just as he touched her, the baby kicked again, a firm, insistent thump against his palm. A slow, wondrous smile spread across Honya Haka's face, transforming his somber features. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, and it was like watching the sun break over a dark canyon. In that moment, the last of her fear of him dissolved completely. He was not just a protector, he was a man capable of wonder, of gentleness. He held his hand there for a long moment, a silent communion with the life that was to come. He then looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers, and he spoke in his own language, the words soft and flowing. She did not understand them, but their meaning was clear. It was a blessing. He began to speak more of his past, in his fragmented English. He told her of his wife, Istas, whose name meant snow. He spoke of the sickness that had taken her, a fire in the lungs that no herb could quench. He told her of his son, a small boy who had followed his mother to the spirit world only a moon later. His grief was a vast, open wound, and in sharing it, he offered her a piece of his most vulnerable self. Listening to him, Esther felt her own sorrow for her lost life, for the cruelty she had endured, for the child who would be born into this harsh world become something she could bear. Her loneliness, once an isolating prison, was now a territory they occupied together. He was not just her rescuer anymore. He was becoming her friend. Section. He began to carve using a small, sharp knife on a piece of cottonwood bark. Day after day, he worked, the image slowly taking shape under his patient hands. It was a turtle, its shell carved with intricate patterns representing the sun and the moon. For the little one, he explained, holding it up. The turtle carries its home on its back. It is strong. It finds its way. The gift was a promise that this child would have strength, would have a home, would find its way in the world. Esther took it, her fingers tracing the smooth wood, and wept silent tears, not of sorrow, but of a gratitude so immense it felt like a physical ache in her chest. Their quiet existence was shattered by the sound that had first heralded Honyahaka's arrival, hoofbeats. But this time it was not a single horse, it was two, approaching fast. Honyahaka was instantly alert, his body coiled like a snake, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. He motioned for Esther to stay back in the deepest shadows of the cave and moved to the entrance, flattening himself against the rock, a silent, deadly observer. Esther's heart hammered against her ribs. She recognized the arrogant posture of the lead rider before she could even make out his face. It was Walter Vance. And with him was another man, a hired gun by the looks of him, with a brutish face and a pistol strapped low on his hip. They reined in their horses near the ashes of an old campfire, their eyes scanning the area. "I tell you, I heard the talk in Prescott," Walter was saying, his voice sharp with irritation. "A prospector swore he saw a Cheyenne brave with a ghost woman living up in these mesas. It has to be her. Damned woman is probably telling everyone I abandoned her. I can't have that." "So what do you want to do?" the other man asked, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "Just fetch her back." Walter laughed, a dry, ugly sound that scraped along Esther's nerves. "Fetch her? Don't be a fool. I'm here to tie up a loose end. No body, no crime. We find her, we finish it. And the Indian, too. No witnesses." Ice flooded Esther's veins. He hadn't come back for her. He had come to erase her. The man she had once, however foolishly, called her husband, was here to murder her and her unborn child. A primal protective fury rose up in her, a force she had never known she possessed. She looked at Honyahaka. His face was granite, his eyes narrowed to slits, fixed on the men below. He was calculating, waiting. He was one man against two, one of whom was armed with a firearm. The odds were not good. Esther knew she could not just hide in the shadows and wait for him to die for her. She was not the passive, helpless creature Walter had left for dead. This cave, this man, this harsh and beautiful land had changed her. The turtle carving was clutched in her hand, its wooden shell pressing into her palm. The turtle carries its home on its back. It is strong. She was strong. Walter dismounted, peering toward the rock face. "She's got to be up in one of these caves, spread out. Find her." As the hired man began to move to the left, Walter started toward their shelter. He was getting closer. Honyahaka drew his knife, the polished stone blade gleaming dully in the shade. He was preparing to fight, to die. Esther acted. She remembered a pile of loose stones near the back of the cave, gathered by Honyahaka for building up their fire pit. Her mind, suddenly sharp and clear, saw a chance. She scrambled toward them, her large body moving with a surprising quickness fueled by adrenaline. She picked up a rock, the size of a loaf of bread, its weight solid and real in her hands. Peeking over the ledge at the side of the cave entrance, she saw the hired man, his back to her, looking up at a different fissure in the rock. Honya Haka was poised to ambush Walter, who was now only feet from the entrance. They would see each other any second. She did not hesitate. With a great, grunting heave, she threw the rock. It sailed through the air in a clumsy arc and landed with a sickening crack on the ground several yards to the hired man's right. He yelled in surprise, spinning around and drawing his pistol, his attention completely diverted from the cave. What was that? Probably just an animal, Walter called back, annoyed. But the sound had made him pause, his head turned toward his partner. That was the opening Honya Haka needed. He moved, not like a man, but like a shadow, detaching itself from the rock. He was on Walter in 2 silent strides, one hand clamping over his mouth to stifle his cry, the other pressing the razor-sharp edge of his knife against the man's throat. Walter's eyes went wide with terror, his body frozen in shock. The hired man turned back. "Mr. Vance?" He saw the scene at the cave mouth, and his hand tightened on his pistol. "Let him go, Indian." Honya Haka did not move, his grip like iron. He was a statue of vengeance, his dark eyes burning with a cold fire. Esther stepped out of the shadows and into the light. Her appearance was a shock. Her white hair was a wild halo around her head, her face was pale and determined, and her body, heavy with child, seemed to possess a formidable, earthy power. She was no longer the wilting, broken thing they had expected to find. "Get out of here," she said, her voice shaking but clear and strong. "Leave, now." Walter's eyes, wide with fear above Honya Haka's hand, darted between his hired man and Esther. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. This was not the timid, shamed creature he had tormented for years. "Shoot him," Walter tried to yell, the words muffled against Honya Haka's palm. The gunman hesitated, aiming his pistol. The situation was a stalemate. If he shot, Walter would surely die in the process. He looked at Esther, at the fierce, unyielding expression on her face. "This ain't my fight," the man suddenly muttered, lowering his gun. "You paid me to track, not to get into this mess." He backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving Honya Haka. He mounted his horse and, without a backward glance at Walter, spurred the animal into a gallop and disappeared. They were alone, Honya Haka, Esther, and the man who had tried to destroy them both. Honya Haka's knife pressed deeper, a single drop of blood welling up on Walter's skin. For a moment, Esther thought he would kill him. She saw the rage in his eyes, the righteous fury of a man protecting his own. She saw the ghosts of his wife and child standing behind him, demanding retribution. But then his gaze met hers. He saw her face, the plea in her eyes. This was not their way. Killing him would make them like him, ruled by cruelty and violence. Honya Haka's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He was not a murderer, he was a survivor, a protector. He let out a long, slow breath, releasing the rage. He shoved Walter away from him, sending him stumbling to the ground. Walter scrambled backward in the dirt, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. You could have." "Go," Honya Haka said, his English clipped and hard. It was the first word he had spoken during the entire confrontation. "My horse," Walter stammered, looking at his mount, still tethered nearby. Honya Haka walked to the horse, cut the reins with a single flick of his knife, and gave the animal a sharp slap on the rump. It bolted, galloping off into the desert after its companion. He then picked up Walter's canteen and emptied it onto the thirsty ground. He turned and looked at the man who had left Esther to die with nothing. "Walk," Honya Haka commanded, his voice as final as a death sentence. He was not murdering Walter. He was giving him the same chance he had given Esther. He was leaving him to the judgment of the land, the same unforgiving anvil that had almost claimed her. Walter stared at him, then at Esther, his face contorting with hatred and fear. He knew he was beaten. He got to his feet and began to stumble away on foot, a small, pathetic figure quickly swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. He would not survive. They both knew it. The silence that descended was profound. The immediate threat was gone, leaving behind the tremor of what had almost been. Esther looked at Honyahaka, her heart overflowing with a mix of terror, relief, and something else, something deep and powerful she could not yet name. He had been ready to die for her. She had found the strength to fight for him. They had faced the monster from her past, together, and had won. Honyahaka walked to her, his face reverting to its usual stoic mask, but his eyes were full of a new light. He reached out and gently took the turtle carving from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. He looked at it, then back at her. No words were needed. He understood her courage, she understood his sacrifice. He turned and walked back into the cave, and after a moment, she followed him, stepping from the harsh glare of the sun into the cool, quiet dark. The world outside no longer mattered. They were home. 2 weeks later, under a sky filled with 1,000,000,000 stars, Esther's labor began. It was a long and difficult birth, but Honyahaka was with her through all of it. He was not panicked or squeamish. He was a calm, steady presence, his hands gentle and sure. He held her, murmured words of encouragement in his own tongue, and wiped the sweat from her brow. He seemed to draw strength from the earth itself, channeling it into her. In the deep, quiet hours just before dawn, as the first pale light touched the horizon, her son was born. He was a small, healthy baby, with a surprisingly full head of downy white hair, just like his mother's. Esther held him to her breast, weeping with exhaustion and a joy so pure it felt sacred. Honyahaka looked at the child, his face filled with a tender reverence. He reached out a single finger and gently touched the baby's cheek. The infant, impossibly, turned his head toward the touch. "He has your hair," Honyahaka said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But his eyes, they are dark, like the good earth." They lived on in the shelter of the mesa, the passing seasons marking the rhythm of their new life. The baby, whom Esther named Amos, grew strong and happy. His world was the loving gaze of his mother and the quiet, devoted presence of the man who was, in every way that mattered, his father. Honyahaka taught Esther the ways of the land, which plants healed and which nourished, how to read the clouds, how to live not against the desert, but with it. Esther, in turn, brought a softness to his solitary life, filling the silence not with chatter, but with the warmth of companionship, the sound of her quiet humming as she rocked Amos, the simple comfort of a shared meal. They never spoke of love, not in the way the world she'd left behind defined it. Theirs was a connection forged in a crucible of survival and cemented by mutual respect. It was a bond quieter and deeper than any romance built on fleeting passions. It was in the way he would bring her the first small flower of spring, or the way she would save him the choicest piece of meat. It was in the shared smiles over their son's antics, and the comfortable silence they could share for hours, watching the sunset paint the canyons in hues of fire and rose. One evening, as Amos slept soundly in a cradle Honyahaka had crafted for him, Esther sat beside the fire, watching him mend a moccasin. She thought of Walter, of the jeering crowds, of the loneliness that had been her constant companion. It all felt like a story that had happened to someone else, in another lifetime. She was no longer Esther Hale, the pale spectacle. Here, in this wild, unforgiving place, she had finally become just Esther, a woman, a mother. Honyahaka looked up, as if sensing her thoughts. His eyes met hers across the flickering firelight. He didn't smile, but his gaze was full of a serene contentment. He had lost a family and had been hollowed out by grief. She had never had a family and had been hollowed out by cruelty. And here, in the unlikeliest of places, they had found the pieces of themselves in each other. Together, they had built a home, not of wood or stone, but of unexpected kindness and resilient love. The turtle, after all, always carries its home on its back, and they, The strange and broken family brought together by fate had finally found their way.